Welcome to our virtual South by Southwest partner programming planning discussion. We're excited to welcome you all to our discussion here today on how we can decriminalize drugs to reduce harm and build justice. I'm Dahlia Heller from Vital Strategies, a global public health organization where I lead an initiative to reduce overdose deaths in the United States. Today, I'm joined by our esteemed panel, Reverend Charles Boyer, Teresa Springer, and Kurt August, for a conversation on an incredibly timely topic: decriminalizing drugs to reduce harm and build justice. Lately, there's been a lot of media attention around this issue of drug decriminalization. Voters in November 2020 in the state of Oregon made a wise decision to decriminalize all drugs and focus on a strong public health response instead. But this year, 2021, also marks the 50th anniversary of Nixon's launch of the war on drugs, which is an escalation of a punitive response to drug use and has resulted in mass criminalization and incarceration in this country. Black and brown communities continue to be disproportionately affected by this war on drugs, despite the fact, and we know this for a fact, that rates of drug use are similar across racial and ethnic lines. And meanwhile, here we are in the midst of the worst epidemic of drug overdose deaths this country has ever experienced. We're on track to report more than 80,000 lives lost to overdose in 2020 in the midst of this COVID pandemic. Overdose is a preventable public health problem, not a criminal legal problem. But because we treat drug use like a crime, it's much more difficult to actually prevent overdose. Criminalization shapes moralism and stigma against drug use, making drug use risky and increasingly lethal. Overdose is just a tragic consequence of criminalization. So today, we'll hear from a reverend, a criminal justice professional, and a harm reduction advocate as we imagine and work towards a future that decriminalizes drug use and centers racial justice, so we can address drug use as a health issue and not a crime. We have a lot to cover and learn from our discussion today, and I'm excited to introduce our panelists. Let me begin with Reverend Charles Boyer. Reverend Dr. Charles Franklin Boyer is a pastor and the founder of Salvation and Social Justice, a Black faith-rooted public policy organization based in New Jersey. He's a leading faith voice for racial justice issues, and his advocacy has resulted in big strides for justice in New Jersey, including last year, early prison release for more than 2,000 people to prevent COVID risk. This, alongside other important wins, the closure of youth prisons and the restoration of voting rights for people on probation, to name just a few. Next, we have Kurt August. As the Deputy Director of Diversion and Deflection in the Managing Director's Office of Criminal Justice Initiatives in the city of Philadelphia, Kurt supports police efforts to connect people who use drugs to community-based services and treatment instead of arrest. Kurt has extensive experience working in nonprofits, policy analysis, and community outreach, and we're pleased to have his perspective on our panel here today. Next, we have Teresa Springer. Teresa has a long history of working in harm reduction and HIV prevention services and has held a variety of roles over the years. As the Director of Programs at Wellness Services in Flint, Michigan, Teresa promotes harm reduction, focusing on health education, community engagement, and providing safety services to people who use drugs. Big thanks to our panelists for joining us here today, and without further ado, let's get started with our discussion. So let's begin with the first question. Why do we need to decriminalize drugs in order to reduce harms and build towards justice? Reverend Boyer, why don't you kick us off?
Sure, thank you. So I look at this obviously from a faith perspective, particularly from a Black faith perspective. And so when we look at the drug war, it's important to understand that the drug war is an extension of the subjugation and commodification of Black bodies. Slavery has never been abolished in the United States. The 13th Amendment basically moves slavery from the plantation to the prison. It basically moved slavery from crop picking to the criminal justice system. That's how the Constitution reads. As you said in the intro, this marks the 50th year of the drug war. And if you are convicted of a crime, you are then technically a slave. So as an AME preacher, African Methodist Episcopal preacher, in a faith that's founded in abolition, the drug war must be abolished. We come from a faith tradition that is rooted in abolition, the push for freedom. And also, right, as a faith leader, just the necessity to deal with the stigma, the cultural taboos, the necessity to elevate, to recognize people's humanity, to deal with things from compassion and health and healing is critically, vitally important. And lastly, I'll say faith, or let me better say religion and denominations were involved in slavery, and faith was involved in freedom. And so as people who identify as faith leaders and people of faith, we have to decide which we identify with.
Thank you very much. Situating us in a historical context to understand where we are today. Next, then, let's hear from you, Kurt August.
So I really think that your introduction, Dahlia, and the Reverend's points really kind of highlight a lot of issues that are central to this. And I think the fact is that we can't deny sort of the extent of the harm that's been caused by the criminalization of drug use. And really the public demand and proliferation of drugs in this country is a health issue, and it's not something that's really something that should be integrated into criminal law. Frankly, the criminal justice system has consistently demonstrated, or addressing people's underlying needs to address people's complex unmet health needs, either through, if any, effective integration, criminal sanctions have served as amplifiers to inequality when it comes to employment, housing, and even the underlying issues of family and social cohesion that we know are foundational, to kind of have appropriate supports to address people's health needs. Decriminalization is also primarily, as the Reverend is highlighting, a racial equity issue, which is something that our country is trying to reconcile with in this very moment, and has been failing to do so for centuries, arguably. So decriminalization really acknowledges that the selective enforcement of drug laws has had a devastating effect on communities of color throughout this country. And it's important. It's an important step, really, to stem the tide of mass incarceration in our communities that we all recognize as something that's alive and well today. So we really need to detach kind of public health issues and putting them at the feet of law enforcement and the criminal justice system to try and address issues that it's ill-equipped to handle.
Thank you very much. Yes. So here we are today then. And Teresa, from your perspective, what does this mean, decriminalize drugs then, to reduce harm and build justice?
Thank you so much. So I kind of want to build on what both Kurt and Reverend Moyer said, and talk about the public health portion of it. So as you know, like criminalization of drugs, it breaks up families, it doesn't get at root causes, and it creates more harm than it does good. And so with decriminalizing drugs, you get at a deeper level when you allow communities to heal from things that have caused harm through the years. And when I say heal, I mean Black, brown, and indigenous bodies being locked up and forgotten, and those mental health issues that arise from them things, like being able to move dollars from systems of harm to systems of care and compassion. And so instead of locking people up for things that they have no control over, we look at people's lives with compassion and get them the things that they need. And that goes for people who use drugs and people who deal drugs as well. I feel like they're removed from that conversation a lot and need to be put back into that conversation, because mass incarceration goes both ways. They harm our societies on both levels. A lot of times people are using drugs to get at the traumas that we don't address as a society, our medical mistrust, that mistrust in our social justice systems. And the same way with with people that deal drugs. People that deal drugs are dealing drugs to feed their families, to meet basic needs that are not being met by society. And so including both of those in the conversation is really important. And then another point I wanted to make, that decriminalizing drugs reduces a lot of things. It reduces arrests, it reduces incarceration. It actually reduces the people who use drugs. It reduces that for some reason. And then that money that we put into that system can be redirected into better systems.
Wonderful, thank you. That's great. So I think between our three panelists, we've shaped a very clear picture of where we've come from and where we are today with this issue. So then for the people who are watching, what would you each say is one thing that people in our audience could do to move us towards the shift that you've all laid out very clearly needs to happen? What's one thing people could do? Reverend Boyer, let's start with you.
Well, yeah, thank you. So first, let me pretext this with, I'm about to do a Black preacher thing. I'm going to give you one thing that has several parts. So one, first, we have to build movements, right? And those movements have to be, I appreciate how Kurt and Teresa have framed this, because it's really critical that we build movements that are led by the folks who have been most impacted by the drug war, folks who have the visceral, existential experience of feeling the depth of the harm, are the ones who are best equipped to define what the healing should look like. So that's critical. And faith leaders, the faith community plays a critical role in this, because many of us played a critical role in sanctioning and bringing about the punitive measures, the punitive criminal justice response. Even within Black communities, the Black faith community was out in bullhorns calling for more police presence and locking people up who were dealing with things. And so there's a shift in theology that needs to take place. And one of the major pieces, and I think Teresa framed this out perfectly, is the failure of Reconstruction, back to the abolitionist framework, the failure of Reconstruction was the absence of reparations. And so it is critical that we not just do decrim, but that the shifting of those resources that are already available and being used as decrim becomes the order of the day, that those resources which once enforced punitive measures now goes towards diversion and investment in people as opposed to punishing people.
Thank you very much. We appreciated all those points. That is the point. Kurt, what would you say?
Yeah, really, I want to dovetail something that the Reverend closed with in terms of the diversion aspect. So that's something that's ongoing right now in terms of pre-arrest diversion models that are connected to drug use. So until there is a change at the state and federal level around the enforcement of drug laws, setting up these sort of harm reduction focused arrest diversion models that integrate people into community-based supports in real time as an alternative to getting processed, sanctioned, facing supervision from the criminal justice system or potential incarceration, but not connecting people to those sorts of forms of punishment and putting them into the appropriate level of care at real time when there is contact with the police, something that's ongoing. But I certainly want to stress that has to have a harm reduction focus. We don't want to sort of proliferate models that sort of piggyback on the carrot and stick approach, where non-compliance or for someone that's not willing to go straight into drug and alcohol treatment is going to be facing potential sanctions to it, but more of an emphasis on meeting people where they're at, addressing their needs and what feels like help to them in real time, and really just trying to offer them a realistic outlet to supports in the community. In addition to that, though, I would certainly recommend that everyone in this audience has a role to play in sort of the participatory budgeting approach when it comes to how resources are allocated in your local communities. Far too much is certainly gone towards, we spend a proportionate amount towards sort of the enforcement of drugs as we do similar to public housing and education and things of that nature. So budgets really do reflect our priorities as a community. And that's something that everyone in this audience can get involved in. And I want to also connect something to Teresa's point earlier about things that decriminalization helps reduce. One of the other things that it's going to be a key in reducing and that everyone can play a part in their everyday interactions is the reduction of stigma. And that's really around people that use drugs when they're no longer folks that are also being incarcerated and having, again, the conditions of their inequality sort of amplified and put on public display. It really reduces the stigmatization of people that use drugs and normalizes it as a behavior that's happening all across this country for centuries, and is something that will make it a lot more likely for us to be able to work with people compassionately and appropriately in a way that's going to be substantial for them.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Finally, last but not least, Teresa, where would you leave us? What can people do?
I kind of want to piggyback on Kurt a little bit about bringing it out of the dark and into the light. And when we destigmatize things, we bring it into the light and bring it out of that darkness, and we bring it out of those dark places where people feel like they have to hide and they have to they start doing things that they don't normally do with their lives, so they can actively use these substances. Where when someone is in the light, I think of wine drinkers and cigarette smokers. When it's destigmatized, you don't have to hide, and you become a more functional member of society, and it's just so helpful. But one point that I want to make is the power in our voices and the power that we have to enact change. And the more of us that learn about harm reduction approaches, that learn about compassion, that learn that these tools of dignity and love can really get at things. And then we use that voice to create change. The more of us that want drug decriminalization, we'll get it. We'll end up with it, because there's power in our collective movements. And when we include this in that movement, then there's it's limitless. We can do whatever we want to with it. And if we move that toward compassion, that's just a beautiful thing. Yeah.
Thank you very much. What a beautiful way to leave us. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists today for sharing their time and really important insights and unwavering dedication to this work to end overdose, build racial justice, and promote a healthier future for us all. I think we recognize we're in the midst of this devastating overdose crisis. As I mentioned, it's a public health crisis, but we continue to, in this landscape shaped by punishment and a centuries-old history, as Reverend Boyer has shaped our conversation here, to show that this is really about this racialized war on drugs that stems from all the way back from the time of slavery. We continue to use punishment as our response, and drug use has become the latest tool to reinforce this unequal citizenry in this country. So in this effort then to decriminalize drugs, if we decriminalize drugs, we can achieve racial and social justice, as you've all described. We can move towards a unified movement that can bring us to that place where we have faith communities, community leaders for health and justice, policymakers, and public practitioners coming together, such as yourselves, to make that change happen. I'm really inspired by all of your efforts and your work in this area, and I'm grateful that you're all out there across this country doing this work, because we are, and we know we can make real progress to not only end overdose, but truly have fair policies for everyone in this country, to recognize, as Kurt, you've noted, where we put our money is where we make our investments, is defined by how we prioritize, who we prioritize in this country. And that if we're going to finally achieve racial justice in the United States, we have to keep our eye on where we're directing our investments. For additional information on this session, please visit our website at vitalstrategies.org. I'm Dahlia Heller. Thank you for joining us.